Good evening.
Good evening.
There we go. See, I'm not scary. You can talk to me. How y'all liking this weather?
Yeah. Not at all. I know.
It will pass.
I like this. When it's like 90 and it drops down to like 60, I feel like I need to wear like 5 layers. Now, I'm hot just wearing this jacket. If I wasn't sweating so much from being hot wearing this jacket, I would take the jacket off and just be wearing this polo. Because it's been like 1 degree all week, and now all of a sudden it's like 30 something.
So you're sweating like it's summertime, huh?
Yeah. This weather's pretty nice.
Wait till you get 80 and you'll be wearing 3 layers. Yeah.
Well, hopefully I won't have to take, copious amounts of blood thinners at my old age.
If you live past 30.
Yeah, if I live that long. Yeah, that's true.
He says he's going to die by 30.
Hard living.
Oh, no, he'll stay. He'll remain.
Only the good die young, right? So I'll be 140.
His mother says no such luck.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're in Zechariah chapter 9. And I will point out, when we started chapter 7, actually, I kind of called that the second half of Zechariah, and that's kind of where I split, kind of the main, that's where I put the main shifting point. A lot of people put it on chapter 9, and there's some good reasons to do that. There's the phrase that starts out, verse 1, the burden of the Lord, that comes back in chapter 12. And it also comes up in Malachi as well. Starting in chapter 9 going forward, there's no mention of the temple being rebuilt. There's no mention of Joshua. There's no mention of Zerubbabel. Even Zechariah, his name is not mentioned going forward, I'm pretty sure. So it's pretty big shifting point in terms of how the book is written, which like we talked about when we did the background info of chapter 1, a lot of people, there's like 10,000 different views onto when this was originally written and by who. But we're not going to get into that tonight. But anyway, we are, I guess, sort of all that to say where, if we weren't in chapter 7 and 8, we're definitely now in chapter 9 in a very different type of book than the first 8 chapters. We're not going to have vision accounts. We're not going to have, sermons with a very clear message. And as we're going to see in chapter 9 tonight, there's a lot of stuff that seems like it could be applied to a lot of different things. Could be applied to the Old Testament, could be applied to the New Testament, could be applied to the church age that we live in now, could be applied to the end of times. And so very different sort of book going forward. But, if you're into that, then good. We got a few chapters of that. If you're not into that, then we're like already technically over halfway done with the book. So, just deal with it, I guess. But anyway, we're gonna start with the first 8 verses. So starting in verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord against the land of Hadrach and Damascus its resting place. For the eyes of men are all the tribes of Israel, and all the tribes of Israel are on the Lord. Also against Hamath, which borders on it, and against Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. For Tyre built herself a tower, heaped up silver like the dust, and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will cast her out. He will destroy her power in the sea, and she will be devoured by fire. Ashkelon shall see it in fear. Gaza also shall be very sorrowful, and Ekron shall, for he dried up her expectation. The king shall perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. A mixed race shall settle in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. I will take away the blood from his mouth, the abominations from between his teeth. But he who remains, even he shall be for our God, and he shall be like a leader in Judah, in Ekron like a Jebusite. I will camp around my house because of the army, because of him who passes by and him who returns. No more shall an oppressor pass through them, for now I have seen with my eyes. So, yeah, you got a pretty short handout tonight. So, a lot of this might go quick. And a lot of this, the first thing is like all these city names or like country, nation names. A lot of this we already talked about when we covered Amos, right? That's the, for one sin and for two of this place, I'm going to do this. And for one sin and for two of this place, I'm going to do this. And it goes on and it goes on until it gets to like Israel or Judah and then Israel. And it's just sort of a list of judgments. And so a lot of this we've already covered. But if you're like me, that was a long time ago. And we don't exactly remember all that. And these are not necessarily place names that we, drive to on a daily basis. I don't exactly frequent, the Burger King down at Hadrach or Hamath, right? And some of these places are actually new and not found in Amos, so I thought it'd be helpful if we just kind of went through all of them. So Hadrach is the first thing that's mentioned. This is a Syrian city-state, and this is actually located north of Hamath. So that should give you a key as to when we get to Hamath where that's from. Damascus, well, that one, for all of you history scholars, should be pretty obvious. That's Syrian as well. This was the capital of Syria, or Aram, an ancient enemy of Israel, right? There's several places in the Bible that we could point to. But David, when he was in charge, he stationed some troops in Damascus when he took Syria. But then by the time of Solomon's reign, there was a guy named Rezon, and he gathered up some men, camped out at Damascus, and the Bible called him an adversary to Israel. So there's this back and forth thing between Damascus and Israel. Sometimes it's under Israel's control, sometimes not. And, that's most of these places, actually. Hamath, that's another new one. Also a Syrian city, but also the name of the territory surrounding the city. Could be talking about the city, could be talking about the whole sort of region. And this city was actually on a pretty major trade route, so it was a very important city. This wasn't exactly Talala. This was OKC or something, or Tulsa. And the region of Hamath was taken by King Jeroboam II around 780 BC. However, it eventually fell to the Assyrians around 720, around the same time that the Assyrians started exiling the northern kingdom. So again, was sort of under Israelite control, then it wasn't, back and forth kind of thing. So the first three are all Syrian, right? Hadrach, Syrian city-state; Damascus, the capital of Syria; Hamath, a Syrian city, very important Syrian city. And then the next two are Phoenician, right? Tyre, a Phoenician city. Phoenicia is Syria, modern-day Syria, Lebanon. This was a somewhat independent city-state. And after the destruction of Sidon, it became the most important Phoenician city. And it was well known for its slave trade, right? We covered that when we were in, I want to say Amos because that's where all these city names were from, but I think it was actually Joel. But anyway, one of the minor prophets we covered talked about that, and we've already got into that. But very wicked city, but also a very powerful city, especially after the fall of Sidon. So Sidon is the oldest Phoenician city, and also perhaps the strongest. The Israelites actually, this was part of what they were supposed to take during the Canaanite conquest. They actually failed to do so in the book of Joshua. They failed to drive off the Sidonians, and it was sort of this Rivalry going on ever since. So now we're getting into Philistine, cities. Philistia had like 5 main cities, and we have 4 of them named here. So we have Gaza. This also was at one time under Israelite occupation. This was where Samson made his last stand, where he brought down the temple of Dagon. So a lot of history here for people. Everyone who was hearing this prophecy would have known where this was and why it was significant. And you have Ekron, also a Philistine city. And this was one of the cities where the Ark of the Covenant was carried to, right? When the Philistines took the Ark, they carried it to several different places, and then it ended up they carried it to one, and a statue fell over, and then it fell over one time and its head was cut off. Crazy story. This was a city, once again, everyone who heard this prophecy would know, oh, Ekron, we hate that place. And then Ashkelon, this was also a Philistine city. It was never actually under Israelite control. So it was just kind of doing its own thing. And then the final Philistine city is Ashdod. Then this is actually the city where the ark was carried to, and Dagon ended up getting decapitated. And this was also at one point under Israelite control, and then it wasn't, back and forth kind of a thing. You should be seeing a pattern by now with these cities that at one point were under Israel's control and at one point weren't. And then the last 2 are all pretty specific to Judah or Jerusalem. You have Judah. This is kind of a give me, but right, this is the southern of the 2 kingdoms of the divided monarchy. The northern kingdom, of course, being Israel. And it consisted of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin and some of the Levites, which is why they were able to, reinstitute temple worship and sacrifice. So then we have mention of my house. This is probably the most interesting because we don't exactly know what this is, right? What is our knee-jerk reaction when we see this? What would we think that it would be?
Temple?
The temple, right? Yeah. You don't have to second guess yourself. That's the point of a knee-jerk reaction. Right. We think it's the temple. However, the word that is normally used for temple is not the word that's used here. It literally just is like the word for house. So is it the temple? Maybe. It could also be talking about Jerusalem. It could be talking about Judah as a whole, or it could just be talking about the people of God in general. The meaning overall of the passage doesn't change a whole lot. The point is still, right, God's protection and God's dwelling. But it is interesting, right? Are we dealing with the temple? Are we dealing with Judah? Or are we dealing with all of God's people expanding outward from Judah? Which we'll talk about that a little bit later. So then, okay, well, what is the message of the first 8 verses, right? We have a whole lot of the king of Gaza perishing and Ashkelon not being inhabited and, cutting off the pride of Philistines and taking away blood from their mouths. It's kind of graphic, right? But what is sort of the message, right? So here's the main idea. Though there are large cities and wealthy cities and influential cities and even wise cities, like it says about Tyre and Sidon, though there are all these great cities, ultimately, behold, the Lord will cast her out. He will destroy her power in the sea, and she will be devoured by fire, right? The cities will fear. The cities will be sorrowful. And ultimately, God will protect his people. And like it says, no more shall an oppressor pass through them, right? All these cities named were kind of a big deal. We have the capital of Syria. That's a pretty big deal. We have the strongest and the oldest Phoenician city. That's kind of a big deal, right? We have 4 of the 5 cities of Philistia, right? Those are big deals, especially, right, to the people listening. They're like, I hate all these cities because the ark of God, right? The most holy object in my religion, was carried off to at least two of these cities, and was put up in pagan temples, right? They all are very significant cities, but ultimately, despite their wealth and despite the number of people they have, or how large they are, or even how wise they are, right? God's going to protect His people, and He's going to judge these cities, much like we've already seen in Amos. So that brings us to verses 9 and 10. This is a very short section, but it's a pretty significant section. So verse 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. So, yeah, I literally just put like Jesus or not Jesus. We should never assume that a passage is messianic just because we've already been, always been told that it is. But it is messianic. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying, right? Why is it messianic? That's the point I'm trying to get to. What's interesting, right, is even Jews, both ancient and in the time of Christ and even modern, agree that this passage is messianic. It's talking about the future Messiah. However, obviously, right, they're going to argue that Jesus is not the Messiah that fulfills this. And I'm pulling some quotes from one particular website, but I mean, the argument goes pretty much the same for most modern day religious Jews. So, they're all pretty much going to argue in the same way. But they argue, and this is a quote, thousands of people 2,000 years ago came to Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. That was one of the main modes of travel. The real problem here is that riding on a donkey is an insignificant side point of the passage in question. This detail is not unique to the Messiah. To which I would say, they're absolutely right in asserting that the donkey is not the main focus of the passage. They're absolutely true, right? That is not the main focus of what the Messiah is coming to do. The main point of Jesus coming to earth, even in this prophecy, is not just so he can ride a donkey. That would be kind of goofy. Right? They're right about that. However, if you're a modern day Jew today, and the Messiah is yet to come, and I don't know, I mean, this is not a very good argument that I would say to a Jew. I just think it's kind of interesting. If the Messiah is still to come, right, then if a dude today, or even in the future, 100 years from now, rode into Jerusalem riding the donkey, that actually would be pretty significant. They're right. 2,000 years ago, everyone was riding donkeys. Why would one dude riding a donkey be all that significant? What makes Jesus riding a donkey stand out? Nowadays, if some dude is riding a donkey in Jerusalem, that's pretty weird. I've been to Jerusalem, and I can tell you, people do not ride donkeys in Jerusalem, right? You go out a little ways. I mean, you got, like your Arab, camel riding, nomadic people, and that's kind of cool. But like, people don't ride donkeys in Jerusalem. It's a modern city, right? We have cars, we have taxis, and there's a whole lot of tour buses. And there's also people, with giant trucks of produce that will run you over without a second thought. But there's not donkeys, right? And again, that's not a very good argument that I would use if I was actually, trying to convince a Jew. But I do think it's kind of funny. The thing that they say is the main point of the passage, which they're right about, is this idea of peace that the Messiah will bring. And they're absolutely right about that. They say, modern day Jews say, Jesus certainly did not inaugurate a utopian world of universal peace. This is also true, right? That's a true statement. I mean, the world is just as crazy and unpeaceful now as it's ever been, right? Maybe more so, we could even argue. Right? Jesus was not focused on, world peace as we would define it today in the 21st century. But the prophecy is not, world peace. What it says is, he shall speak peace to the nations. If you remember the words that were actually spoken at Jesus' birth, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace, goodwill towards men. So Jesus' birth and his ministry, his death, ultimately his resurrection, what it brought was peace from God, right? Jesus never really brought peace between man and man. The worst wars in human history have happened since Jesus ascended to heaven. In terms of gruesomeness and total body count. Any way you look at it, the world has only gotten, worse seemingly. But what Jesus brought was peace between God and man, right? Peace from God is what Jesus brought. Jesus spoke peace to the nations. Jews will point out the differences in Matthew's account and John's account of the triumphal entry. This is another thing that they point to. In Matthew's account, you have Jesus riding seemingly two different donkeys. And that's, I think I'll get into it in a minute. But anyway, in John's account, you just have him riding one. So you have, and again, this is a quotation, and trying to show how Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, Matthew, the gospel writer, constructs an absurd scene with Jesus mounting two animals at the same time and riding them into Jerusalem. His words, not mine. But anyway, the common way that this is explained as to why Matthew seemingly has Jesus riding two donkeys and John has one is Matthew is very focused on showing the exact fulfillment of this prophecy. Not just this prophecy, but I mean, Matthew's whole gospel is very much concerned with Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and typology, right? So Matthew is sort of quoting from the Septuagint. The Septuagint makes it sound like there's two separate animals. Really, we're just dealing with one animal here, right? He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So we're only dealing with one animal. The Septuagint, which is what Matthew would be reading and quoting from, makes it sound like there's two. So in trying to convince his audience, who would also mostly likely be using the Septuagint, that Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy, he writes that Jesus rode on two donkeys. Whether Jesus actually rode on two donkeys or not doesn't really matter, because it's not the point of why Matthew included that detail. And yeah, obviously Matthew is not an idiot. He would know that Jesus cannot ride two donkeys simultaneously. I mean, imagine, being like the greatest con artist in history and fabricating this, complete lie about this Jewish man from the first century who, is the Son of God and descended to earth and was born of a virgin and lived, a perfect life and then died, and you get like all of the historical details down, all of these people, Pilate, Herod, they were all real people, the place names and all the history, you got that all down to a T, and then, oh, dang, I accidentally made Jesus ride two donkeys at the same time. Like, no, Matthew is not an idiot. Obviously, he understands that you can't ride two donkeys at the same time. If you could, though, that would be cool. And I would like to see that in a circus at some point. Right? But that's not the point. So, yes, obviously, this is talking about Jesus. None of the arguments that this would not be talking about Jesus really hold any weight. And I mean, yeah, the only reason that they don't want to make it out to be Jesus is because they don't want to admit that Jesus is the Messiah. But it is messianic. Everyone will agree it's messianic. And clearly Jesus is the Messiah being mentioned here in these verses. And that's pretty much all there is to that. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. So we're just going to go from there. Verse 11 through verse 17, the end of the chapter. As for you also, because of the blood of your covenant, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope. Even today I declare that I will restore double to you, for I have bent Judah my bow, fitted the bow with Ephraim, and raised up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and made you like the sword of a mighty man. Then the Lord will be seen over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will blow the trumpet, and go with whirlwinds from the south. The Lord of hosts will defend them. They shall devour and subdue with sling stones. They shall drink and roar as with wine. They shall be filled with blood like basins, like the corners of the altar. The Lord their God will save them in that day, as the flock of his people, for they shall be the jewels of a crown, lifted like a banner over his land. For how great is its goodness, and how great its beauty. Grain shall make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. So I just sort of asked, what is the timeline of chapter 9? And this is really, I think this is probably the most productive way to address this chapter, because a lot of this stuff, it's like, what the heck? We have like, kings dying, lands being uninhabited, blood being taken from people's mouths, going on to the section we just read, we have like a waterless pit, and Ephraim and Judah being raised up against Greece. Like, I think this is probably the best direction to take this. So basically, are we dealing with the first coming of Jesus or the second coming of Jesus? Or are we talking about Jesus at all? Right? Perhaps it's both. Perhaps it's neither at the same time. Right? Maybe it's both the first and second coming. Maybe it's also neither the first and second coming, all at the same time, if that makes any sense. In the first section, we have mention of Syria and Phoenicia and Philistia, and all of these, like we said, were very prominent ancient powers, right? Whatever judgment God wanted to deal out to these nations and these territories and these people, he would have already done it by the time Jesus was born. I mean, think about now, we're 2,000 years removed from that. I mean, these nations aren't significant anymore, right? The top 5 nations most likely to, cause conflict, international conflict, Syria, Phoenicia, and Philistia probably aren't on that list. Okay, if we're talking about the first coming, like, it wouldn't really apply because these nations were already dealt with. If we're talking about the second coming, which for us hasn't even happened yet, like, yeah, these nations really don't have anything to do with that. The first section, however, it ends by saying that there will no more shall an oppressor pass through them. And this is a pretty vague prophecy, right? This can be applied very literally. This can be applied symbolically in a hyperbolic way, and the Bible does use hyperbole quite often. This can be applied spiritually, or it can be some combination of all three of those. And if you want to apply it more symbolically, hyperbolically, there was some amount of peace, between, like post-exile to the New Testament. There was some amount of peace in Judah. However, there was also a lot of war and unrest in this era, right? The whole, Maccabean revolt thing, that was pretty bad. That definitely wasn't, a peaceful time to be alive and in Jerusalem. So, if you want to apply it that way, it could be applied that way. But it doesn't fit entirely, if you want to apply it, to the Messianic age, like I already said, Jesus brought peace from God, which would be spiritual peace. So that would be interpreting it more in a spiritual sense, right? Well, it's not talking about like world peace, like people aren't killing each other, but it's talking about spiritual peace. In which case, right, that would be the Messianic age, and sort of the church age as well. If you want to go for like an absolute literal interpretation, in the end days, it appears like there's going to be a very literal world peace that's going to occur, right? So like I'm saying, all of these, aspects is it okay? Are we dealing with the first coming of Christ or the second coming of Christ? Well, in a way, we're kind of dealing with both, but also we're kind of dealing with neither, because this could also just be talking about, Old Testament Judah. Going back to Zechariah 9, God promises to be for his people, sort of camping around them. And obviously, God did that in, post-exilic, intertestamental times. In the New Testament time with Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ literally was like God dwelling with man. So like that's pretty obvious. Same with the church age. We now have the Holy Spirit. And in the end of days, right? Obviously we have, God protecting his people, camping around his people, dwelling with his people, right? And then we get into, like the coming king, the messianic part of verses 9 and 10. But even that, which we know was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, there's still mention of like Ephraim and horses and bows. And, it still sounds very ancient. It still sounds very Old Testament, right? The language doesn't necessarily sound first century AD. And then the Messiah's dominion, it says, shall be from sea to sea and from the ends of the earth. And like I talked about when we covered the final vision, vision number 8 in Zechariah 6, I said, we're in the very early stages of the institution of the Messianic age. And you had the chariots, and they were in some way sort of preparing the way for the Messiah outside of Judah and outside of Jerusalem, right? And the whole idea was God's dwelling place being expanded out to the whole world was sort of the point of the 8th vision. So that, it's the same idea in chapter 9. God's dwelling place is about to expand to the whole world, right? The Messiah, Jesus, in a literal sense, he doesn't have a physical kingdom, right? Not yet. He's, he doesn't, Jesus is not the president of America in a literal sense. Jesus is not, the dictator or whatever of North Korea in a literal sense, right? But if the whole point is like chapter 6, God's dwelling place is going out, and by spreading the gospel to people of every race, every nation, right? God's dwelling place expands to the whole earth, like we talked about in chapter 6, then the Messiah, his dwelling place would be from sea to sea and from every corner of the earth and all of that, right? In a less literal sense, right? And like I said, then, so you have like the immediate context in which, well, all of this, for the Messiah is being prepared right now in Zechariah's time. You have the messianic context in which, well, Jesus is the one who is being prepared for, and his message is going out, and God's, spiritual kingdom is expanding to the whole world. And that's really the church age in which that happens. You also have the end of times in which, okay, now it seems like we're going to get like a literal kingdom, and there's going to be like literal dominion over the entire world, right? You see, the timeline of chapter 9 is it about Jesus? Yes. And also, in a way, it's kind of not. Is it about Jesus' first coming or second coming? Well, it's kind of both, and also kind of not either of them at the same time. The last section that we just read, verses 11 through 17, it's following the same sort of pattern. There's a sense in which this was fulfilled in the Old Testament. The language here is very post-exilic, right? You have restoration, you have protection, you have deliverance. All of this is post-exilic language. But all of this could be applied to Jesus, right? All of this could be applied to the church age. And even all of this could be applied to the end of times. The immediate context is, the blood of your covenant, right? Go back to verse 11. Because of the blood of your covenant, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. In the immediate context, this is just talking about the old covenant in the Old Testament. And God is saying, okay, because of this, I haven't forgotten the covenant. Because of that covenant, I'm going to set you free from exile in Babylon, right? Which, had probably already happened, but this is probably serving more as an encouragement than like an actual prophecy of the future. But that's besides the point, right? There's that. But, this could also be applied to Jesus, right? This could also be applied to the church age. This could also be applied to the end of times. This section, this entire chapter, it can be applied to pretty much almost any time in human history since it was written. The problem becomes, well, how literal is the prophecy meant to be taken? And I think that this kind of depends on where you are in the time since it was written, right? But the point remains, God has and will destroy his enemies. And there is and will be a feast, a big celebration when it happens, right? The very end, grain shall make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women in verse 17, right? That's the point, right? Whether you want to interpret this, obviously the people in Zechariah's time would not have had any conception of Jesus or who he was. So if you're the first person, the first group of people hearing this, right? This is all happening around you, right? God has delivered us from exile. God is now dwelling with us. God is now protecting us. He is camping around us, right? Our enemies, the ones responsible for our exile, the ones who benefited from our exile and the destruction of our temple and our home, they will be dealt with. And God will return to us. God will dwell with us. God will camp with us. And because of this, we're going to celebrate. We're going to have a feast. There's going to be grain, and there's going to be wine. And it's going to be great, right? If you're in the Messianic age or the church age like we are now, right? We read this and we think of Jesus, right? Especially because we have verses 9 and 10, which were fulfilled in Jesus. But even the other stuff. The no more shall an oppressor pass through them, for now I have seen with my eyes, right? In a more, spiritual sense, right? Okay, obviously there is war, and obviously there are oppressors, and those oppressors pass through us. But in a spiritual sense, there is peace, right? That Jesus brought, where, okay, well, there's war going on around me, but I have peace with God, right? There are oppressors passing through me, but that doesn't really matter now, because I have peace. If you're at, the end of all times, after all of the crazy shenanigans that we find in Revelation, and you're looking upon Jesus, then this is pretty literal. No more shall an oppressor pass through them. That's pretty much, in a literal sense, that we have achieved world peace. And so I think, how literal the prophecy is all depends on where you are when you're receiving the prophecy, where you are in human history when you're reading the prophecy. And that's one of the cool things about prophecy in general, and specifically Zechariah, is, right, there's sort of this immediate context. There's also a lot of context about the Messiah, about Jesus, the church age. And there's also even some context for sort of the end times. So anyway, I didn't get into a lot of like, what does this all mean? Because we don't really know. Again, it depends on, do you want to interpret this like a, 6th century Jew, or do you want to interpret this like, a 21st century end times preacher? But the ultimate meaning is the same. Judgment for God's enemies, God coming to his people, dwelling with his people, protecting his people, and peace, whether symbolic, whether spiritual, whether literal, peace coming from God because of that. So anyway, are there any questions or anything that anyone wants to add to any of that?
I mean.
All right. And I'll pass it off to Brother